Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the series on medieval church history. Last time we finished the life of St. Isidore, Bishop of Seville. Today we move on and cover St. Bede the Venerable. He is the 16th Doctor of the Church in terms of when he was born. He has traditionally been referred to as the Venerable Bede, the Venerable Bede. Later in church history, the term venerable came to have a specific meaning as one who was being considered for canonization as a saint, and had reached the point at which the church publicly declared that a person's life demonstrated heroic sanctity. Bede lived in a time when the loss of central imperial government and poor communication rendered such structured canonical procedures impossible. The description of Venerable, actually during his life, there were people who called him, the Venerable, but after his terms of writing about him, the description was first applied after his death at a council held at Aachen, today on the Belgian-German border, in 835. This was a recognition of the profound respect in which his memory was held, and because many of his students became figures of great importance in the secular and ecclesiastical world of the Middle Ages, and they wished his memory to be honored. Bede was formally canonized and declared a doctor of the Church by Pope Leo XIII on the 13th of November, 1899. So even though he is now a saint, officially, the description venerable remains, not for canonical reasons, but just for reasons of historical usage. Bede was born in and spent all of his life, except for a couple of trips he made in service to the monastery, outside. But apart from that, he spent his whole life in the kingdom of Northumbria. On today's maps, let's see. No, better one. Yeah, this will do. Okay, this is a current map of England. Let me see. Yeah, see England. See London's in the south. And, so let's see where you see the Humber. Let's see right there. That's an estuary, the Humber River. So Northumbria is north of the Humber River. So today it's just part of England. So the city of York is probably the most significant, certainly historically, because it dates from Bede's time, is in the north of England. So that's where. All right. So this political entity of Northumbria came into being in 604. A year after Pope Gregory the Great died. No, that is the year he died. 604 is the year he died. When two previously separate kingdoms of the Angle tribe on the northeastern coast of England were unified. So the kingdom of Dira in the south was the southern, right on the Humber, and then north of that was the kingdom of Bernicia. But they came together in 604 and became Northumbria. At the time of the unification of the two kingdoms, they were pagan. So these, remember, we talked about that after the fall of the Roman Empire and the Roman Britannia, they were invaded by the Anglo-Saxons, but there were three. The Anglo, which is called Anglo, that was a tribe. The Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, Jutes. So Jutland, like on today's maps, England, any fans of military history know Jutland is a peninsula off the coast of which there was a famous naval battle in the First World War. So that's where the Jutes were from Jutland. That was named for them. But they came over, Anglo-Saxons, Jutes came over perceiving an opportunity after the Western Empire fell, and they proceeded to carve up England into a series of successor kingdoms, Northumbria being one of them. At the time of that Northumbria came into being, it was pagan, but a king, King Edwin of Northumbria, converted to Nicene Christianity, to Catholicism, in 627, after marrying a princess from the Jute kingdom of Kent. You remember in the life of St. Gregory, when he sent St. Augustine, who in English history is known as St. Austin of Canterbury, to re-evangelize, he started in the south of England in Kent and succeeded. So they were converted. So when King Edwin entered into a marriage alliance with the Kingdom of Kent, and that he married a Catholic girl, and so she facilitated his conversion, and then since he was the king, that facilitated the conversion of Northumbria. In 635, the next king of Northumbria, Oswald, invited a monk from the monastery of Iona to come with other monks to establish a base to preach to the population. The people on the farms, to actually go and instantiate the faith, essentially door to door. It would be village to village. So St. Bede wrote about this in Book 3, Chapter 3 of his work, The Ecclesiastical History of the English Church and People, as follows. Oswald, as soon as he ascended the throne, being desirous that all his nation should receive the Catholic faith, whereof he had found happy existence in vanquishing the barbarians, sent to the elders of the Scots, among whom himself and his followers, when in banishment, had received the sacrament of baptism, desiring they would send him a bishop, by whose instruction and ministry the English nation, which he governed, might be taught the advantages and receive the sacraments of the Christian faith. Okay, so Bede this guy did not govern the whole English nation. He just governed Northumbria. England was carved up into several kingdoms at the time. Nor were they slow in granting his request, but sent him Bishop Aidan, a man of singular meekness, piety, and moderation, zealous in the cause of God, though not altogether according to knowledge, for he was wont to keep Easter Sunday according to the custom of his country, which we have mentioned before. From the 14th to the 20th moon, the northern province of the... Actually, I'm going to skip that and just summarize. Just keep in mind there's a difference regarding Easter, so I'm going to skip down. On the arrival of the bishop, the king appointed him his episcopal see in the Isle of Lindisfarne, as he desired, which place, as the tide flows and ebbs twice a day, is enclosed by the waves of the sea like an island, and again, twice in the day, when the shore is left dry, becomes contiguous to the land. The king also humbly and willingly, in all cases, giving ear to his admonitions, industriously applied himself to build and extend the Church of Christ in his kingdom, wherein, when the bishop, who was not skillful in the English tongue, preached the gospel, it was most delightful to see the king himself interpreting the word of God to his commanders and ministers, for he had perfectly learned the language of the Scots during his long banishment. From that time many of the Scots came daily into Britain, and with great devotion preached the word to those provinces of the English over which King Oswald reigned, and those among them that had received holy orders administered to them the grace of baptism. Bishop Aidan was himself a monk, of the island called, well, it's Iona. Bede uses another name, but it's Iona, whose monastery was for a long time the chief of almost all of the northern Scots and all those of the Picts, and had the direction of their people. That island belongs to Britain, although the Scots, anyway, being divided from it by a small arm of the sea, but had long since been given to the Picts, given by the Picts, who inhabit those parts of Britain, to the Scottish monks, because they had received the faith of Christ through their preaching. It goes on and on, but this is enough for us to understand what happened. So connecting this to what we had covered previously, the monastery of Iona, that he referred to, was established in 563 on an island. Let's see, I had this. It's off the west coast of Scotland. It's so tiny. Maybe it's just my eyes. Can't see. This one. Yeah, this map is. No, I don't see it on. Oh, here it is. Yeah. Okay, so this is Scotland, and so this when he referred to this. So this is England. Northumbria is here. You go up to Scotland, and so there's Iona, off the west coast of Scotland. So it was founded. The monastery was established in 563 by Saint Columba, after he was one of the monks that was a spiritual disciple under Saint Finian at the Irish Abbey of Clonard, which we talked about in a previous session. Time passed. 67 years later, in 630, another Irishman, who's now remembered as St. Aidan, the St. Aidan that Bede mentions, joined that monastery of Iona as part of the movement of Irish evangelization of the successor kingdoms that we discussed in a previous lecture. His selection to fulfill King Oswald's request changed history. St. Aidan, that's A-I-D-A-N, St. Aidan is considered the apostle of Northumbria, having converted the northern Anglo-Saxons, mostly Angles. The Saxons are mostly in the south, the Angles in the north, from paganism to Christianity. And the Lindisfarne. He mentions, Okay, so Bede mentions the Lindisfarne, where he went. So here's England, northern England, so right there, that's where Lindisfarne would be. So Scotland was, Iona was over here off of Scotland, and Lindisfarne is over here off the coast of England. Okay. So, as previously covered, the South, Kent, the re-evangelization of England started in the South with Kent by missionaries, Italian and Frankish missionaries, who had studied, dispatched by the Pope, studied in Rome, so they knew the Roman Rite, and they were led initially by St. Augustine of Canterbury, who in English history is known as St. Austin. Here we see that the north of England was re-evangelized by Celtic monks. Now, while the core beliefs of the two, those of the Roman and the Celt, were the same, there were some striking liturgical differences. Most notably, as Bede mentioned, the date for celebrating Easter. So and this is the first time this had come up in history. So the seminarians, if you had to remember the Patristus course last year, the Quartodeciman problem. So the biblical context of this is as follows. The first Passover is described in the book of Exodus chapter 12, and its annual celebration is commanded by God through Moses. It took place on the 14th day of the month of Abib, That month was later renamed the month of Nisan, Nisan. Further details of the annual celebration of Passover are outlined in the book of Leviticus, chapter 23. All four gospel accounts agree that Jesus was executed on a Friday and that the empty tomb was discovered on a Sunday. Example, Matthew chapter 28, verse 1. They differ, however, on the detail of whether or not that Friday was a Passover. The Matthew, Mark, and Luke indicate that Jesus celebrated the Passover with the apostles prior to his death. That's the Last Supper. So Matthew chapter 26, verses 17 through 20. Mark chapter 14, verses 12 through 17. And Luke chapter 22, verses 7 through 15. John, the Gospel of John, indicates that Jesus died before Passover, since the Jewish officials could not enter the praetorium in order to avoid ritual impurity. That detail is in John chapter 18, verse 28, and chapter 19, verses 14 and verse 42. So how do we resolve this? Well, Jews used different methods for calculating the date of Passover. Because the Passover, Passover was the first full moon following the spring equinox. The equinox is when day and night are of equal length. So the first full moon following that is when Passover would occur, regardless of the day of the week. So how do you figure out when the equinox occurs? I mean, now we can just log on to the Naval Observatory website and find out. But back then they had to use that different ways. And Jews used different methods for calculating the equinox. And this is a problem that Christians also shared. It's how to figure that out. So the theory, to explain this, is that Nazareth, where Jesus was raised, and used a different method than the Sadducees used in the temple for calculating the equinox, and therefore the Passover would could fall on a different day. And we know that Jews, it is definitely known that different groups use different methods. For example, the Essene community, a Jewish monastic community we talked about in the ancient history course, always began Passover on a Tuesday. In any case, this ambiguity posed a problem for Christians who wished to honor the resurrection. On the Jewish liturgical calendar, which is a lunar calendar, it's on the 14th day of the month of Nisan, but it doesn't establish a day of the week. So, the day of the week problem. In antiquity, again we covered this in last year's course, there was a sect of Eastern Christians who celebrated Easter on the 14th of Nisan, regardless of the day of the week on which it fell. So they were called the 14ers, the Quartodecimans. This difference emerged in the reign of the 11th Pope, St. Anicetus. And for that purpose, St. Polycarp traveled to Rome to defend the Quartodeciman practice that he was taught by the Apostle John. They agreed that annual celebration of Easter was the important thing, but left the question of the date open. Roman practice at the time was to celebrate the resurrection every Sunday. And then a later pope established it would be one Sunday. It would be the Sunday following the first full moon, which followed the spring equinox. And that is the usage that the First Church Council adopted, the Council of Nicaea, First Council of Nicaea in 325, which we covered earlier in the course. But the council did not provide a formula for determining the equinox. So they decided on a Sunday, but again, you have the equinox problem. So how to determine it? The one method was simply to just pick a date and then just say, okay, every year that's the equinox, and then whatever the first full moon is after that, Easter will be the first Sunday following. But even that's not uniform. So some might say, okay, it's March 21st is the vernal equinox, the spring equinox. Others might say it's March 22nd. And that makes a difference. So if you pick the 22nd, but you have a full moon the day before, then you have to wait a whole lunar month. And people fight over this. But another method was attempted to ascertain the precise date on which day and night were equal length, which would not necessarily fall on the same date. So according to Bede, this resulted in the Celtic equinox being calculated to fall between the 15th and the 25th of March. Yet a third method was, in fact, a category with several variations of formulas to reconcile the solar year of 365 days with the lunar year of 354 days by crafting a cycle which would turn on adding extra days or an extra month in order to align the seasons with the date. Rome began using an 8-year cycle in the year 222. We know this from Hippolytus, who was a father in the ancient church. Then, they later, in the year 290, they switched to an 84-year cycle. Then, in 390, they adopted the formula of Alexandria, which was in which 19 solar years equaled 235 lunar months. And this was retained until Dionysius Exiguus calculated, and that's Dennis the Thin, we talked about him already, calculated a 95-year cycle in the year 525. And that became normative for Rome. But it never made it all the way to Ireland. So these Celtic monks had never even heard of that. So returning to England. 31 years after St. Aidan began his work in Northumbria brings us to the year 664. The difference between north and south of England in the time of celebrating Easter was becoming too confusing to endure. So the king at the time, King of Northumbria, King Oswy, invited everybody to a synod at Whitby to resolve the issue. And here is Bede's account in Book 3, Chapter 25. In the meantime, Bishop Aidan being dead, Finan, who was ordained and sent by the Scots, succeeded him in the bishopric and built a church on the Isle of Lindisfarne, the episcopal see. Nevertheless, after the manner of the Scots, he made it not of stone, but of hewn oak, and covered it with reeds. And the same was afterward dedicated in honor of St. Peter the Apostle by the Reverend Archbishop Theodore. At this time, a great and frequent controversy happened about the observance of Easter. Those that came from Kent or France, so Kent's in southern England, and then France that followed the Roman usage, so it means those who followed the Roman usage, affirming that the Scots kept Easter Sunday contrary to the custom of the universal church. Among them was a most zealous defender of the true Easter, whose name was Ronan, a Scot by nation, but instructed in ecclesiastical truth either in France or Italy, who, disputing with Finan, convinced many, or at least induced them to make a more strict inquiry after the truth. Yet he could not prevail upon Finan, but on the contrary made him the more inveterate by reproof, and a professed opposer of the truth, being of a hot and violent temper. Thus, it is said to have happened in those times that Easter was twice kept in 1 year, and that when the king, having ended the time of fasting, kept his Easter, the queen and her followers were still fasting and celebrating Palm Sunday. This difference about the observance of Easter, while Aidan lived, was patiently tolerated by all, as being sensible that though he could not keep Easter contrary to the custom of those who had sent him, remember he was from Ireland, yet he industriously labored to practice all works of faith, piety, and love, according to the custom of all holy men, for which reason he was deservedly beloved by all, even by those who differed in opinion concerning Easter, and was held in veneration, not only by indifferent persons, but even by the bishops. But after the death of Finan, who succeeded him, when Colman, who was also sent out of Scotland, came to be a bishop, a greater controversy arose about the observance of Easter and the rules of ecclesiastical life, whereupon this dispute began naturally to influence the thoughts and hearts of many who feared, lest having received the name of Christian, they might have run in vain. This reached the ears of King Oswy and his son Alfred, for Oswy, having been instructed and baptized by the Scots, and being very perfectly skilled in their language, thought nothing better than what they taught. But Alfred, having been instructed in Christianity by Wilfrid, a most learned man who had first gone to Rome to learn the ecclesiastical doctrine, rightly thought this man's doctrine ought to be preferred before all the traditions of the Scots. It was agreed that a synod should be held in the monastery of Strianenshire, this Whitby, which signifies the bay of the lighthouse, where the abbess Hilda, a woman devoted to God, then presided, and that there this controversy should be decided. So Whitby is it's northwest. It's on the northwest coast of England. King Oswy first observed that it behooved those who served one God to observe the same rule of life. And as they all expected the same kingdom in heaven, so they ought not to differ in the celebration of the divine mysteries on earth, but rather to inquire which was the true tradition, that the same might be followed by all. He then commanded his bishop Colman first to declare what the custom was which he observed, and whence it derived its origin. Then Colman said, "The Easter which I keep, I received from my elders, who sent me bishop hither. All our forefathers, men of God, are known to have kept it after the same manner, and that the same may not seem to any contemptible or worthy to be rejected. It is the same which St. John the Evangelist, the disciple beloved of our Lord, and all the churches over which he presided, is recorded to have observed." Okay, so that's the quartodeciman, the position. Then Wilfrid, being ordered by the king to speak, delivered himself thus: "The Easter which we observe, we saw celebrated by all at Rome, where the blessed apostles Peter and Paul lived, taught, suffered, and were buried. We saw the same done in Italy and in France, when we traveled through those countries for pilgrimage and prayer. Far be it from us to charge John with folly, for he literally observed the precepts of the Jewish law, being a Jew, whilst the church still Judaized in many points, and the apostles were not able at once to cast off all the observances of the law which had been instituted since Moses, in which way it is necessary that all who come to the faith should forsake the idols which were invented by devils, that they might not give scandal to the Jews that were among the Gentiles. For this reason it was that Paul circumcised Timothy, that he offered sacrifice in the temple, that he shaved his head with Aquila and Priscilla at Corinth, for no other advantage than to avoid giving scandal to the Jews. So John, pursuant to the custom of the law, began the celebration of the feast of Easter on the 14th day of the first month. The month of Nisan was the first month of the lunar calendar. Not regarding whether the same happened on a Saturday or any other day. But when Peter preached at Rome, being mindful that our Lord rose from the dead and gave the world the hope of resurrection on the first day after Sabbath, that's why he celebrated it on a Sunday, on this Sunday following. Okay, it goes on and on, but that's enough you get the point. So everyone listened to both sides. The Roman position was defended by St. Wilfrid because he spoke the language better. Wilfrid had been a monk at Lindisfarne, so he knew the Celtic usage. Yet, later in life, he served as a monk in Kent, in southern England, which followed the Roman practice, and he had even made a pilgrimage to Rome, as Bede notes. So he understood, and had actually lived under both forms. His argument was that the quartodeciman position, as well as the various methods of calculating the equinox, had long traditions behind them, which were not denied, but that only St. Peter had been named as the rock on which the church would be built. And he was given that position by Jesus, so that only Peter's successors in Rome could be relied on to render final decisions. So the Celtic defenders pointed to St. John the Evangelist as their precedent, but they could point to no analogous biblical passage granting John the same status as Peter. So King Oswy decided that his kingdom would conform to Roman practice, which is the north of England. And the Roman practice was already in the south of England, in Kent. The following year, 665, King Oswy named St. Wilfrid bishop in Northumbria, and Wilfrid chose York as his see. In terms of Bede's life, this meant that when Bede was born in Northumbria in the year 673, 9 years after this synod, his region was of Roman observance. St. Wilfrid was the ecclesiastical superior of Northumbria, and Bede actually met him twice. In the year 674, 1 year after Bede was born, King Egfrith of Northumbria, you love these Anglo-Saxon names, Egfrith, granted land on the river Wear to St. Benedict Bedushin for the establishment of a monastery. It became the Abbey of St. Peter at Wearmouth, meaning the mouth of the river Wear. This guy, Benedict, was an Anglo, born in Northumbria. In his youth, he had made a pilgrimage to Rome. On his return, he lived as a monk on the island of Lorraine for 2 years. And we covered that in the Patristus course. It's off the coast of France in the Mediterranean. He then returned to England, where he served as abbot of the monastery of Saints Peter and Paul in Canterbury, in the Kingdom of Kent, for an additional 2 years. King Egfrith was impressed with his wide range of experience and wanted the best sort of abbey that would be accessible to the people and not isolated on islands like Iona and Lindisfarne. So Benedict pursued a style of Pachomian monasticism that was distinctly Isidoran, St. Isidore, inspired by Isidore, in that it followed the template articulated by Isidore. He did not use the rule of Isidore in every detail, but he did incorporate the example of Isidore's practice as Archbishop of Seville. So the practice at this monastery in Northumbria used the regula of St. Benedict of Nursia, the rule of St. Benedict, structuring life around the balance of work and prayer. It also included, this is where you get the Isidore influence, the ideal of the ascetic scholar monk as envisioned by Cassiodorus, with pursuit of sacred art in the form of manuscript illumination, which was rooted in a Celtic monastic tradition brought from Ireland to Iona, and then from Iona to Lindisfarne, and now from Lindisfarne to Wearmouth. And it included the very high calling of a churchman held by Isidore as sacramental figure, spiritual leader, custodian of public order, master of the law, and a healer through medicine. To this end, Abbot Benedict made regular trips to Ireland and to the continent with some of his monks for the purpose of copying books and bringing them back. In this way, his monastic library boasted 500 volumes of classical, sacred, and biblical text. And that's huge when you consider every one was written by hand. Within 6 years, by the year 682, the new abbey was filled. So King Egfrith gave Abbot Benedict another piece of land 7 miles away on the River Tyne. Abbot Benedict assigned one of the Wearmouth monks, along with 20 companions, to establish a new foundation, which became the monastery of St. Paul at Jarrow. During Abbot Benedict's time, it was not an abbey, it was a priory, as he wished to rule the two, Wearmouth and Jarrow, as a single community. The monk assigned to this task of establishing the priory at Jarrow was St. Colfrid. One of the 20 he brought with him was a 9-year-old Angle boy named Bede. He was given to Wearmouth by his family, or he was just abandoned at the doorstep, which is probably what happened. So the name Bede, it's from an Anglo-Saxon word, Bede, means prayer. So like the rosary beads, prayer beads, etc. So Colfrid became Bede's like a spiritual father and surrogate father, frankly. In the year 685, one of the endlessly recurring wars between the Angles of Northumbria and the Picts in Scotland erupted. The usual reasons for all of these wars: theft, control, just we hate each other's guts, ethnic hatred. At a victory by the Picts prevented Northumbria from taking land in Scotland. In the following year, 686, an illness swept through the new foundation at Jarrow that left all but Colfrid and Bede unable to fulfill their duties. In fact, most of the monks died. From the details left, it's not possible to identify the disease. They called it the sweating sickness. Whatever that is, it's some kind of fever. But it was obviously lethal because it killed everybody but 2. In the same year, 686, Sussex, which is in the south of England, became the last pagan successor kingdom in England to convert to Catholicism. So it is accurate to finally apply the description Roman Catholic to England once more for the first time since the empire fell. England was not yet politically unified, but at least at the level of the rulers, 686 represents the first time that all of England was Christian since Roman Britain fell 147 years earlier. And that's, I picked that date, so not necessarily when the empire fell. As you remember, there were still old imperials in Roman Britain that held on for a time. So that the date when they fell is considered 539, when the last Britanno-Roman military units were defeated by the Anglo-Saxons at the Battle of Camlann Field. And this is all part of the Arthur legend, that would be a whole nother lecture. We don't have time for that, so we got to stick with history. Although there is Arthur is based on a historic person, with literary accretions later. Anyway, 2 years later, 688, Ina, the king of Wessex, conquered Essex and part of Kent. So in England, in the south, all of the areas that have the suffix sex. That means they were Saxons. So Essex, Wessex, Middlesex. Those were all the Saxon kingdoms in the south. The Angles were in the north, and then the Jutes. The Jutes were in Kent, and then later, later, of course, we'll get to when the Danes and the Vikings come in and they settle in the middle. Anyway, so 688, Ina, king of Wessex, invades Essex, conquers it, and he takes land from Kent. Since all the kings were now Catholic, this represented a Christian attacking Christian for political and economic gain. Sadly, this demonstrates that the pre-conversion barbarian pattern of violent and predatory tribal warfare was going to continue, as it did in the other successor kingdoms, the Franks in France, the Burgundians in eastern France and Switzerland, the Visigoths in Spain, the Ostrogoths in Italy. What to say? It's sin exists. It is a lamentable but undeniable fact that so far the gospel, as it, even Jesus, he couldn't. I mean, look what they did to him. He preached peace and they nailed him to a cross. So far, it has failed to remove this element of concupiscence from the human condition. It is equally sad that so often the wars undertaken as a result of pre-conversion impulses, but after conversion would be attributed to the malevolence of the church simply because all the rulers had become Christian. So they were acting in the same predatory, homicidal way they did before they became Catholic. Yet somehow it's the church gets blamed. The church is political, therefore it's the church's fault. Such a judgment is shallow, anachronistic, and inaccurate. Jesus never commanded such actions in the Bible, nor was such behavior encouraged, defended, or warranted by any part of the New Testament. Those sins existed long before the church, and they continue in spite of the truth having been revealed. So it's probably best just to consider, that right, just sin exists. Okay, we'll leave it at that. 689, the monastery at Jarrow offered hospitality to the 9th abbot of Iona, Saint Eunan. In the course of the interminable cycles of fighting between the Angles of Northumbria and the Picts in Scotland, 60 Picts had been captured and were being held for ransom by the Angles. You see, they're still barbarians. It's just criminals, criminal activity, kidnapping and ransom. So St. Eunan was traveled to Northumbria at the request of a Pict king from Scotland to negotiate the freedom for these guys. In other words, to negotiate a ransom. The significant reason I'm mentioning this is that Brother Bede, young monk, was 16 years old, and he was assigned to be Abbot Eunan's servant during Eunan's stay. Now, Eunan had a personal interest in history, having authored the Vita of St. Columba, and that's still valuable as a source for the spread of Celtic monasticism. As a young monk, Eunan had attended the Synod of Whitby with his own abbot. So the young Brother Bede listened to every syllable that Eunan uttered, and it triggered in Bede a lifelong interest in church history, and that set him on the path to becoming a doctor of the church. Bede was ordained a deacon in the year 692 by St. John of Beverley. He was a monk of Whitby who later became the founding bishop of Hexham, a city in Northumbria. Bede worked in the scriptorium at Jarrow, copying manuscripts. The scriptorium is just place of writing, so copying manuscripts. When he started, the library at Jarrow had 300 books. By the time of Bede's death, they had copied the last 200 from Wearmouth to keep at Jarrow. In addition, there was a meta project assigned to the monks by Abbot St. Colfrid. Bede's spiritual father Colfrid later, after Abbot Benedict died, Colfrid did become an abbot of Jarrow. St. Paul at Jarrow became an abbey, and Colfrid was the abbot. Colfrid wanted 3 complete, illuminated manuscript copies of St. Jerome's Bible. 1 would be kept at Jarrow, a 2nd would be kept at Wearmouth, and a 3rd he intended to give as a gift to the Pope. It took the monks 24 years to complete this task, to illuminate, the 3 copies of the Bible. But one of them survived, and it became the Codex. In case I forget, it's the Codex. It made it to Rome. In the year 696, the Anglo Catholic community took up the monastic missionary impulse when one of their own, an Angle named St. Willibrord, became the founding bishop of Utrecht on the continent in Holland, in the Netherlands, beginning a mission that earned him the title the Apostle to the Frisians. So this is yet another pagan group, that we're converting, that the church, converted to make the Middle Age. The Middle Ages so all of Europe became Catholic. So Willibrord was born in Northumbria, was given by his family to the Abbey at Ripon on a river in northern Yorkshire, England. And this was a monastery where St. Wilfrid was abbot from 660 until his appointment as Bishop of York in 665. Brother Willibrord lived in this monastery for 20 years, according to the rule of St. Benedict. In 695, he was chosen by his own abbot and by St. Wilfrid to lead 12 monks to establish a missionary monastery in the lands of the pagan Frisians. That's Holland, as a base for spreading the faith. To this end, he was ordained a bishop on the 21st of November, 695, and he was given a new name, the name Clement. Latin clementia means calm, mild. He was 38 years old. So now Clement and the monks settled first in Utrecht, in present-day Netherlands, 30 miles southeast of Amsterdam. That allowed the monks to communicate with the Franks to the south in present-day France, as a means of deriving support to reach out to the pagan Frisians to the north. They had a base of support. In 698, he was able to establish a monastery on the River Sauer, that is now the border between Luxembourg and Germany. This abbey at Echternach became the nucleus of the oldest town that still exists in Luxembourg. Following a pattern that was customary from his ecclesiastical world of the British Isles, Willibrord served as both abbot and bishop. He used these abbeys as bases until his death on the 7th of November, 739, and he was buried at Echternach. So the work was established there. That we had he didn't convert all the Frisians, in the Netherlands at once, but at least he established these bases, these Catholic bases in the Netherlands. Same year, 698, elsewhere in Europe, Saint Rupert established a monastery of St. Peter at Salzburg in what is now Austria. He established the town, grew up around the monastery, and he later became the founding bishop. So it's another case where these missionary monks, one of them served as abbot of the monastery as well as founding bishop of a diocese. The life of St. Rupert gives evidence that the Franks, who had been converted previously, another successor kingdom, the Kingdom of France, had not only begun producing their own vocations to the clergy, but now they were undertaking the missionary enterprise, taking the faith beyond their own people. Rupert, further, was royalty. He was a member of the Merovingian family. And he was not an eldest son, so a lot of people would have had to die for him to have inherited the throne, but he was part of the royal family. He was named Bishop of Worms on the Rhine River, and that's 50 miles south of Mainz. In 697, Rupert embarked on a missionary enterprise into what is now Bavaria, southern Germany. Now, remember, that had never been part of the Roman Empire. So they're really, going in. They're not just converting the successor kingdoms in what had been the empire. Now they're going, out what had never been, terra incognita. In 698, he discovered a salt mine along the river, which is now the border between Bavaria and Austria, less than 100 miles east of Munich. He named the river Salzach, and the town he established Salzburg, so salt, He became its ruler and founding bishop, with an abbey of monks as his staff and support. And this is now part of Austria and was the birthplace of Mozart. Returning to England. In the year 716, St. Culfrid of St. Paul's at Jarrow retired for the purpose of bringing the completed manuscript of the Vulgate to the Holy Father in Rome. Now, we kind of breezed over this in a couple of minutes, but 24 years it consumed in producing these 3 illuminated copies of the Vulgate. Culfrid did not make it to Rome. He died along the way. But he was part of a group, so the manuscript did make it. It's called the Codex Amiatus, because he died on the way. It was at a monastery in Amiata, Italy. And they kept it, for a time. And then in the 18th century, it was moved to Florence, to a library in Florence. So sometimes it's also called the Laurentian Codex, after the library founded by Lorenzo the Magnificent. In either case, I mention it because it is the oldest surviving, complete manuscript of the Latin Vulgate. And it's illuminated. It's beautiful. 4 years later, 720, St. Hubert was ordained bishop. And he became the apostle of the Ardennes. So he's the apostle to Belgium, to convert the pagan tribe there, which was the Walloons. Hubert, or since he was from France, I should say Hubert. He was a Frank. Ethnically, he was a Frank. He was a nobleman from Aquitaine, which is southern France. As a youth, he was addicted to hunting, and he was a count in the Merovingian feudal hierarchy. In the year 708, he received an infused grace in the form of a locution that moved him to leave all of that aside and take a pilgrimage to Rome. In Rome, he studied and lived as a monk of the Benedictine observance. In the year 720, the 89th Pope, St. Gregory II, ordained him a bishop with the task of being a missionary to spread the faith outside of Frankish lands. Hubert obeyed and embarked with a group of monks. He established a monastery first, a base, in which became the nucleus of Liège, Belgium. It's near the confluence of the Meuse and the Orthe rivers. And he spent the rest of his life doing that, converting the Walloons in Belgium. And there he died on the 30th of May, 728. So another piece of the Catholic European puzzle coming together. 11 years later, 731, Bede completed his history of the English church and people. Consisting of 5 books, it covered the development of Britain from paganism at the time of the landing of Julius Caesar in 55 BC, through its development as a Roman province, then its Christianization in the imperial period, followed by the fall of Roman Britain to the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, which brought it back down into paganism, followed by its restoration as a Christian land, beginning with the missionary efforts of St. Augustine of Canterbury, up to the decision of conformity with Roman practice at the Synod of Whitby. In the year 732, a former pupil of Bede, Ecbert, he was a cousin to the sitting king of Northumbria, and he was a brother of the guy who would be the next king. This guy, Ecbert, was named Bishop of York. And St. Bede wrote him a letter that has survived. And it's historically significant because it allows us to precisely date and understand the development of the structure of post-imperial society in the successor kingdoms as a political, cultural, economic construct that endured throughout the medieval period. Now, the people at the time would not have used this word, would not have called it this, but because it was distinct as a system from what went before and what came after, historian, you got to call it something. So this system is called feudalism. So we'll pause here, and we'll devote the next session. It'll still be St. Bede, but it'll be St. Bede on feudalism. So Bede, second part of that. I'll read an excerpt of the letter, and then we'll analyze to understand feudalism, so the rest of the course will make sense. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.